Hi, and welcome to Homo Ludens, a channel on history and board games. In today's video, we'll talk about the basics. If you are interested in war games, but always felt a bit overwhelmed by the jargon and all the different kinds of games there are on the market, well, you're in for a treat. As in today's video, we'll have a serious discussion about what is a war game and what are the different kinds that you can find.
Shall we play a game?
Trigger warning for Grognards. The intent is not to have an endless debate on taxonomy, but just to walk a beginner through the different aspects of our hobby. So, what's a war game? Let's look at a simple definition. Let's start by defining two things. What is war? The accepted definition from the Oxford Dictionary is that war is a state of armed conflict between two factions. Could be countries, paramilitary groups, organization, doesn't really matter. It therefore involves violence and usage of military force. For Clausewitz, war has three main objectives, and those objectives are key to wargame design. 1. Conquer and destroy armed forces of your enemy. 2. Take his material, resources, and means of productions. 3. Gain support from public opinion. So, now that we've defined war, what is a game? A game is a form of play structured by rules. Some argue that rules are the key to the enjoyment of games, as they are defining the frontiers of a small imaginary world in which we can experiment play. There are two main motivations for play: enjoyment and education. Play is unproductive in nature. So there you have it. A war game is a structured form of play, depicting armed conflict, symmetric or asymmetric, where players take control of symbolic military resources and compete with each other for enjoyment, but also to learn something about strategy and history. Now let's talk about where war games came from. Games depicting specific armed conflict are a rather new phenomenon, but the idea of simulating war in games has some ancestors, such as the Chinese game of Go, chess, or its Viking counterpart, Tafel. We could argue that the first real war game was developed by the Prussian military in the 19th century in order to train their officers. It was called Kriegspiel, the game of war. It was played on two separate maps, one for each player, with wooden counters and an umpire, that acted much like a dungeon master in D&D, who was coordinating the game, ensuring the fog of war, and resolving combat based on his own military experience. The Kriegspiel is key to understand what is a war game, because it shows that they are not just about enjoyment. They are also designed as tools to improve tactical and strategic skills, and potentially to test new approaches to military conflict. It is for that reason that war games are interesting to the US Army and think tanks such as the RAND Corporation. To my knowledge, the first set of wargame rules with the intent of enjoyment were written by no other than H.G. Wells. His book, Little Wars, was published in 1913, and he described it as a game for boys from 12 years of age to 150, and for that more intelligent sort of girl who likes boys' games and books. All figurine war games that we play today, from Flames of War to Warhammer Shadespire, are all direct successors of this original set of rules. In the 50s, a new revolution occurred. A guy named Charles S. Roberts released two games published by Avalon Hill, Tactics and Tactics 2, a board game about military tactics that took the idea of a grid from chess, but used counter for units and terrain to add some depth. Using counters had a key benefit. Each unit could store data points printed on them explaining how far it could move and how powerful it was in combat. Even though the tactics games still used square grid, this new approach to wargaming changed everything and opened the road to the golden era of Hex and Counters. Now that we have a definition and some historical context, let's answer a few frequently asked questions about wargames. Already in this intro we used three expressions that are not part of the common language: fog of war, Hex and Counter, and Grognard. So we'll start with those. What is a Grognard? A Grognard, or Grognard, is the way hardcore wargamers like to call themselves. It is a reference to Napoleon's army, as it was the nickname of the soldiers of the Imperial Guard. What is fog of war? Fog of war is a concept in military strategy, coined by Clausewitz, a famous Prussian general, in his book Vom Krieg. The idea behind it is that conflict is characterized by an uncertainty about your opponent's forces, natural conditions, etc. In war games, fog of war regroups all design choices to hide information from opposing players. What is a Hex and Counter war game? It is a classic form of tabletop wargaming that appeared in the 60s after Tactics and Tactics 2, made popular by companies such as Avalon Hill and SPI. The key concept is a map printed on an hexagon grid on which players move counters representing units, each having a specific movement and combat value. Those wargames are still a big part of the wargaming production today, but design choices tend to be more diverse than in the 60s. Are wargame historical games? Well, yes and no. In its open definition, wargames could simulate any kind of armed conflict, historical or set in a fantasy or sci-fi setting. Actually, some of the most popular wargames are non-historic. I will mention some of them in the next video, but I will mostly focus on historical games, as I consider them to be more interesting for two reasons. I'm personally more interested in military history, and historical wargames are also a statement about historical perceptions of specific events that make them an interesting study object if you're interested in historiography. Do wargamers and wargames promote war and violence? That's an endless debate. Wargames depict violent events in a mostly abstract way. They are cultural objects exploring fictional or historical events. Wargamers and wargames are therefore probably promoting even less violence than movies around the Second World War, for example, or if we think about other kinds of games, first-person shooters. Most wargamers that I met are peaceful, passionate about history, and are armchair generals, more interested in being seated comfortably at a table with a cup of coffee, looking at a map and moving counters rather than promoting violence. What's so attractive about wargames? I can only give a personal answer to this question. If I had to sum up why, I would focus on three things. First, I've always loved strategy games, on tabletop, on computers, and for me, wargames are the richest kind of strategy games there is. Then, wargames tell a story. Contrary to Eurogames, for example, when you play a wargame, you see a story unfold in front of your eyes, and this creates good memories and exciting moments. And finally, I always had a strong interest in history, and wargames does something that is amazing. They make history tangible. There is not a lot of things as exciting as playing a wargame and understanding why a general made a specific decision, truly understanding it as it is a decision that you are taking yourself. The last question is, are there a lot of wargames? Well, if you look at Board Game Geek, you have around 80 wargames that were released last year, and most smaller wargames sold in specialized magazines, for example, are not accounted for. So considering that, it's not crazy to say that you have around 2 wargames being released every week. How to make sense of all that amount of wargames that are being released? Well, in the next video we will start looking at 3 core dimensions of wargame design. The first dimension is from abstraction to simulation, and we'll look into what does it mean to be more abstract or more of a simulation kind of game. The second one is historical to non-historical, and all the range that you have in between. And the final dimension is from sub-tactical to grand strategy, and how different scales actually simulate different kind of events. We'll also deep dive into the families of wargame design, block games, hex and counters, point-to-point maps, and how they all differ in their representation of warfare. That's it for today. Thanks for watching this first episode of Wargamology about the basics of wargaming. I hope that you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed writing it. I decided to make those videos after a discussion I had with my brother about my YouTube channel. My point of view is that he was my target audience, as he's a history buff, loves board games, but never played a war game. What he told me after watching the first videos is that he was really interested by the subject, but most of the time during the game reviews he didn't really understood what I was talking about. He felt overwhelmed by the jargon and by the apparent complexity of the games. He made me realize that only doing wargame reviews was not going to help me fulfill one of the goals that I had with this channel, which was bringing new people to the hobby. I would only be talking to Grognards, which is fine, but I would also like to help bring new people in. So I will continue to make detailed video reviews and battle reports, but I also want to do more beginner-friendly content, as I want this channel to be more welcoming to new people and to get them interested in our niche and sometimes very obscure hobby. If you liked it, please like the video, and if you have suggestions about future beginner video on wargames, please feel free to add them in the comments.